The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, unmarked except for her name written in handwriting she hadn't seen in a decade. Inside was a single photograph of two people who no longer existed. A young couple laughing on a beach, their faces bright with the kind of love that believes it will never end. On the back, 3 words that made her hands tremble. I'm so sorry. Sarah Mitchell stood in her kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows of the home she'd built alone, and felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart begin to crack. 10 years had passed since David had destroyed everything they'd built together, since she'd found those messages on his phone and watched her entire future crumble in a single devastating moment. She had moved on, or so she told herself every single day. She had a successful career as an architect, a beautiful home, and a life that looked perfect from the outside. But that photograph, that simple gesture, had awakened something she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it was dead. If you believe in second chances, in the power of redemption and the possibility that people can truly change, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to our channel and share this story, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about forgiveness and love. Drop a comment below telling us if you've ever faced a betrayal, because your story matters too. David Morrison had spent 10 years living in his own personal prison, one built not of bars and concrete but of regret and shame that consumed him from the inside out. The affair had lasted 3 months, a terrible mistake born from fear and weakness during a time when his career was failing, and he felt like he was drowning. He'd chosen the easy escape instead of reaching for Sarah's hand, and when she discovered the truth, he'd watched the light die in her eyes. She'd left him without a second glance, changed her number, moved to a different city, and vanished from his life so completely, it was as if their 7 years together had been erased. For the first year, he'd told himself he deserved her absence, that he needed to give her space. But as year 2 became year 3 and year 3 stretched into a decade, David realized that space wasn't what he was giving her. He was giving up. And that was a betrayal all its own. The decision to find her hadn't come suddenly. It had built slowly through years of therapy, of confronting the broken parts of himself that had led to that devastating choice. David had spent countless hours with a counselor, unpacking his childhood, his fears, his tendency to run when things got difficult. He'd learned that the affair wasn't really about attraction to someone else. It was about his own terror of vulnerability, his fear that he wasn't enough for Sarah, that eventually she'd see through him and leave anyway. So he'd sabotaged everything first, confirming his worst fears about himself in the cruelest possible way. But understanding why he'd done it didn't erase what he'd done. It didn't give him the right to disrupt Sarah's peace. For years he'd wrestled with that ethical dilemma, caught between his desperate need to make amends and his knowledge that he'd forfeited any claim to her attention. Then his mother died, and at her funeral, she'd left him a letter. In it, she'd written about regret, about the cousin she'd hurt 40 years ago and never apologized to, about how that silence had haunted her entire life. She'd written, "Don't be like me, David. Don't let pride or shame keep you from at least trying to make things right. Even if she never forgives you, she deserves to know that what you did was never about her lacking anything. It was all about you being broken. Let her be free of that question mark." Those words had shattered something in him, and for the first time in 10 years, he'd allowed himself to consider that maybe, just maybe, reaching out wasn't entirely selfish. But David didn't just send a letter. He knew that words on paper, no matter how heartfelt, could never communicate the depth of his transformation or the sincerity of his remorse. So he'd started with something else entirely. He'd spent 6 months tracking down every person he and Sarah had known during their relationship: her best friend Maya, his old college roommate Tom, her parents who had treated him like a son until he'd proven himself unworthy. He'd met with each of them, not to ask them to intercede on his behalf, but to apologize to them too. Because his betrayal hadn't just hurt Sarah, it had hurt everyone who'd loved them as a couple, who'd believed in their future, who'd been forced to pick up the pieces when everything fell apart. Sarah's father had been the hardest conversation. The man had looked at him with such disappointment that David had nearly walked away. But he'd stayed, and he'd said what needed to be said. "I destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me, and in doing so, I hurt your daughter in ways I can never fully repair. I'm not here to ask for anything. I'm here to tell you that she deserved better then, and she deserves better now." And I've spent every day of the last 10 years trying to become someone who might have been worthy of her, even though I know I'll never get that chance again." Sarah's father had been silent for a long moment before saying, "Why are you telling me this?" And David had replied, "Because you loved her long before I did, and you'll love her long after I'm gone. You deserve to know that what happened wasn't because she wasn't extraordinary. It was because I was broken, and I broke her too." After those conversations, David had started a project that would take him 2 more years to complete. He'd discovered that Sarah's dream had always been to design a community center in her hometown, a place where kids from difficult backgrounds could find mentorship, art programs, and hope. She'd talked about it endlessly when they were together, sketching designs on napkins, lighting up whenever she described the impact it could have. But life had taken her in different directions, and that dream had remained just that, a dream. David had taken every penny he'd saved, sold his car, moved into a tiny apartment, and worked 3 jobs. He'd created an anonymous foundation and funded the entire project, working with local officials to make it happen. He'd ensured that Sarah's original concepts, the ones she'd shown him years ago, were incorporated into the design, and when the center finally broke ground, he'd made sure the dedication plaque read, "For everyone who believes in second chances and the power of dreams deferred but not forgotten." He'd never put his name on it. He'd never told anyone of his involvement. The center was built, and Sarah had been invited to the opening as a prominent architect from the region, never knowing that this manifestation of her years-old dream had anything to do with the man who'd once shattered her heart. David had watched from a distance as she'd walked through the building, had seen the tears streaming down her face as she'd recognized elements of her own youthful vision brought to life. That had been enough for him. Seeing her dream realized, knowing that something good had come from his decade of penance, had given him a peace he hadn't felt since the day everything fell apart. But Sarah's best friend Maya had figured it out. She'd pieced together the timeline, had noticed David's name buried deep in obscure financial documents, and she'd confronted him. "Why?" she'd demanded. "Why would you do all this and not tell her?" And David had simply said, "Because it's not about me anymore. It never should have been. This is about her getting something beautiful in a life where I once gave her nothing but pain." Maya had studied him for a long moment before saying something that changed everything. "She's never moved on." "David, not really. She's built this perfect life, but there's a sadness in her eyes that never goes away. I'm not saying you deserve forgiveness. I'm not saying she'll ever be able to trust you again, but I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, she deserves to know the truth about what you've become." That conversation had led to the letter, to the photograph, to the beginning of something David didn't dare name. Sarah had called him 3 weeks after receiving that envelope, her voice shaking, asking if they could meet. He'd driven 6 hours to her city, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest. They'd met at a coffee shop, sitting across from each other like strangers who'd once known every inch of each other's souls. She looked older, more guarded, but still so beautiful it made his chest ache. And she'd asked him one simple question: "Why now?" David had told her everything, not to justify what he'd done, but to explain the journey he'd been on. He'd talked about the therapy, about confronting the cowardice that had driven his betrayal, about learning that real love wasn't about grand gestures but about showing up every day, especially when it's hard. He'd told her about the community center, about how seeing her dream come to life had been the first time in 10 years he'd felt like maybe, just maybe, he was becoming someone who could add something positive to the world instead of just taking from it. He'd said, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know that what I did had nothing to do with you not being enough. You were everything, and I was too broken to see it, too scared to hold on to it. You deserved an apology 10 years ago, and I was too much of a coward to give you one. This isn't about me wanting you back. This is about you deserving to know that you were never the problem." If this story's touching your heart, if you believe in the possibility of true change and genuine redemption, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Tell us about forgiveness, whether you've given it or received it. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your engagement helps us share more stories that matter. Sarah had cried then, not the angry tears of fresh betrayal, but the complicated tears of grief and relief mixed together. She'd told him about her decade too, about the walls she'd built, about the relationship she'd sabotaged because she couldn't trust anyone not to destroy her again. She'd talked about the community center, about how walking through it had felt like encountering a ghost of who she used to be before everything broke. And then she'd said something that made David's breath catch. "I've hated you for 10 years, but I've also missed you every single day, and I hate that I've missed you because how do you miss someone who broke you so completely?" Drop a comment right now if you think Sarah should give him a chance, or if you think some betrayals can never be healed. We want to hear from you before you hear the ending. They didn't fall back into love that day or even that year. What David had done couldn't be erased by gestures, no matter how grand, or by time, no matter how much had passed. But Sarah agreed to coffee again the next month. And the month after that. They started as strangers, sharing their separate journeys, learning who they'd each become in the years of silence. David never pushed, never asked for more than she was willing to give. He'd learned patience in his decade of penance, had learned that real love isn't about possession, but about wanting someone's happiness even when you're not part of it. Slowly, carefully, with the kind of caution you'd use approaching something precious that's been broken before, they began to build something new. Not a resurrection of what they'd been, but something entirely different. Something built on truth and hard-won wisdom and the understanding that trust once shattered can only be rebuilt one tiny piece at a time. 2 years after that first coffee, Sarah called David at 3 a.m. crying. She'd had a nightmare about the betrayal, about discovering those messages all over again, and the panic had been so visceral she couldn't breathe. David had driven through the night to sit with her, not touching her, just being present while she worked through the wave of old trauma. He'd said, "You may always have these moments. What I did left a scar, and scars don't disappear. All I can do is be here, every single time, and prove that I'm not that person anymore. However long it takes, however many 3 a.m. phone calls you need, I'm here." And something in Sarah had finally begun to heal. They were married quietly 3 years later, not with the fanfare of their first young love, but with the solemnity of two people who understood exactly what they were promising each other. At the reception, Sarah had given a speech that left everyone in tears. She'd said, "People ask me how I could forgive him, and the truth is I couldn't. Not until I saw that he'd forgiven himself first, that he'd done the work to become someone worthy of forgiveness. He didn't just say he was sorry. He spent a decade proving it, not to me, but to himself and to the world. He didn't demand I take him back. He built a life that honored the love we'd had by making the world a little better. And somewhere in all of that, I realized that holding on to that pain was hurting me more than it was hurting him. This isn't a fairy tale. This is two broken people who decided that maybe broken pieces can still make something beautiful." David had never stopped working at the community center, had made it his life's mission to help others avoid the mistakes he'd made. Sarah had designed 3 more such centers in other cities, her dream multiplying into something bigger than she'd ever imagined. And on difficult days, when old wounds ached, they'd drive to that first center, walk through its halls, and remember that even the worst mistakes can be transformed into something that helps others heal. The story of David and Sarah spread through their community, not as a romance but as a testament to what genuine change looks like, to the possibility that people can confront their worst selves and emerge as something better. Not everyone agreed with Sarah's choice. Some thought she'd compromised herself, that forgiveness of such a betrayal was weakness. But Sarah knew something they didn't. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the inexcusable. It's about refusing to let someone else's worst moment define the rest of your life. It's about choosing freedom over bitterness, hope over resentment, the possibility of new beginnings over the safety of familiar pain. 10 years after the envelope, 15 years after the betrayal, David and Sarah stood together watching the sunset from their porch. They'd weathered storms together and apart, had learned that real love isn't about never falling but about choosing to get back up, together, every single time. And as Sarah leaned into David's embrace, she thought about the woman she'd been. When that photograph arrived, about the walls she'd built and the price they'd exacted, and she felt grateful. Not for the pain that brought them to this moment, but for the courage they'd both found to face it. Because some stories don't have tidy endings. Some love stories break and never fully heal. But some, against all odds, against all reasonable expectation, find their way back to something true. And those stories, the ones built on the rubble of what came before, are perhaps the most beautiful of all. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about forgiveness, redemption, or the complexity of love, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment telling us what you felt, what you thought, whether you've ever faced a choice like Sarah's. Because these stories, your stories, they matter. They remind us all that we're human, beautifully flawed, and always capable of becoming better than we were yesterday. Thank you for watching, for feeling, for believing that even broken things can find their way to beauty.